It began one quiet evening in the heart of Rome, as the sun set over the ancient city and cast golden light on the dome of St. Peter's. Inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV moved slowly through the marble halls, carrying with him the invisible weight that every spiritual leader bears, a burden for souls, a longing for peace, and the fear of what eternity truly holds. He was known for being gentle and wise, always ready with a blessing or a kind word, but lately he had been troubled, his prayers longer, his nights more restless. He confided to a close friend that something had disturbed his soul deep: vision, a warning, and a pain for millions who did not even realize the risk they faced. That night, Pope Leo XIV sat alone in his small chapel, the only light a flickering candle beside the altar. He prayed, asking God to show him what was wrong in the world, what was quietly eating away at the hearts of the faithful, what danger was stealing souls while the world pretended all was well. And then, in a moment that would haunt him forever, Pope Leo XIV was given a glimpse at terrible, clear vision of a soul falling away from the light. He saw a person, outwardly devout, someone who had been baptized, who went to Mass, who even prayed often. This was not a public sinner, not a criminal, not someone lost to hatred or open violence. Yet in the vision, demons surrounded this soul. They mocked and dragged the person into a darkness deeper than night. The suffering, the agony, the cries for mercy, these things pierced the Pope's heart in a way he had never experienced. He saw that this person, whom many would have considered good, was lost forever. The reason for this tragedy was not what people might expect. It was not murder, not blasphemy, not some dramatic scandal. Instead, it was a sin so common, so ignored, that people everywhere barely flinch when it is mentioned. It was the sign of impurity. Specifically the sin of self-abuse, masturbation, a sin that has become so normalized that most people today would laugh or scoff at the idea that it could be so dangerous to the soul. This vision was not given to Pope Leo XIV alone. Across the ages, holy men and women have been warned about the same danger. The Pope remembered the stories of saints, especially Saint Padre Pio, who had suffered from visions of hell and purgatory, who had seen angels and spoken with souls in pain. Padre Pio, a man who was never shaken by the horrors of the spiritual world, once had a vision that left him trembling for an hour, unable to speak. He too had seen a soul dragged to eternal loss for the same reason, not for some great crime, but for a sin the world now calls normal, even healthy. Pope Leo XIV realized that the true crisis was not the loud enemies of the Church, not those who rejected God openly, but the silent, subtle enemy, an enemy who whispers that sin is not really sin, who lulls millions into false comfort, who turns what is holy into what is common, and what is deadly into what is harmless. He saw with new pain how society had changed its language about sexuality. What once caused shame and drove people to confession was now treated as self-care. Therapists and social media experts told people not to worry about purity, to embrace their urges as normal, to let go of guilt and repression. Pope Leo XIV realized that this shift was not just a cultural trend but a spiritual disaster. For generations, the Church had taught clearly impurity is a grave sin. Not because God wants to steal joy, but because God's design for human love is so much greater than what the world can offer. The Catechism, unchanged by the passing fads of modern times, calls this sin intrinsically and gravely disordered. Yet everywhere the Pope looked, he saw Christians, good people, even faithful souls falling into the same pattern. He prayed for wisdom, asking God why this sin was so dangerous, why it could lead even outwardly devout people so far from grace. The answer, he realized, was not only in the act itself but in the habits it formed, the attitudes it grew, and the way it dulled the voice of conscience. Every time a person turned the body, God's temple, into a tool for pleasure without love, it taught the heart to be selfish, to seek satisfaction apart from God's plan. Instead of learning to give love as a gift, the soul learned to take. Instead of preparing for self-sacrifice, it practiced self-indulgence. God's plan for sexuality is beautiful, meant for a complete gift of self, in marriage, as a living image of God's love. When people turn this gift inward, the gift becomes twisted, and the heart begins to close itself off. The Pope's vision showed him the steps so many take, almost without noticing. First, the person feels guilt. The conscience warns that something is not right. This is a sign of God's mercy, a sign the soul is still awake, but soon, rationalizations begin. Everyone does this. It's better than something worse. God understands my needs. The guilt fades, replaced by excuses. Over time, the conscience grows numb. What was once troubling is now routine. The person no longer calls it sin at all. Anyone who says otherwise is marked as old-fashioned, judgmental, or unhealthy. The Pope realized this is the most dangerous stage, not when someone is fighting, but when someone has stopped fighting, when the devil has convinced them that darkness is really light. He understood now, with sorrow, how millions of Christians, perhaps even those sitting in pews every week, were quietly falling into this trap. The greatest threat to the Church was not external attack, but the soft poison of compromise, the loss of the sense of sin, the redefinition of holiness to match the culture's standards instead of God's. Pope Leo XIV thought about the many confessions he had heard over his lifetime. The broken voices of men and women, old and young, who wanted to be free, who fought and stumbled, who felt trapped by the same patterns. He remembered especially the young, who grew up in a world where every device, every advertisement, every voice seemed to promise pleasure with no price, and where the idea of purity was almost unknown. He thought about those who wanted to fight, but who found themselves alone, ashamed, and without support, as he prayed. The Pope understood that the message God wanted him to give was not just about warning or fear, but about hope. He remembered St. Augustine, whose early life was filled with all the temptations and failures that modern people face. Augustine had a mistress, laughed at the Church's teachings, saw no reason to change. But God's mercy is stronger than any weaknesses. When Augustine finally stopped making excuses and turned his heart toward God, he was not rejected, he was transformed. He became one of the greatest saints, not because he was perfect, but because he refused to give up the fight for holiness. The Pope knew this was the real heart of the message, not that God wants to punish those who fall, but that God wants to raise them up, to heal, to purify, to make them strong again. So Pope Leo XIV began to speak first in private, then in homilies, then to the whole Church. He said that love sometimes demands hard truths. To stay silent while souls are being lost is not mercy, but cowardice. He urged priests and faithful to be clear, to call sin what it is, but to call sinners back with compassion, never with harshness. He challenged the Church to open its arms, not only to welcome but also to call to conversion, to invite everyone to the deeper joy and freedom that only grace can give. He told the story of Padre Pio's vision not to frighten, but to remind everyone that eternity is real, that private choices matter forever, and that God's commandments are not meant to limit love but to protect it. He encouraged those struggling with impurity not to despair. Every moment of resistance, even when it ended in failure, was a sign of God's grace at work. He told them God was not counting failures, but cheering every time they got up, every time they confessed, every time they started again. He reminded them that the sacrament of confession is not a place of shame, but a wellspring of new strength. He urged practical steps, cutting out temptations, being honest with friends or a spiritual director, seeking out good habits and holy friendships, and most of all, returning again and again to prayer, the sacraments, and the loving arms of Christ and Mary. Pope Leo XIV warned that the enemy today does not come in obvious forms, but in clever disguises. The devil comes in the voice of therapists who say sin is healthy, in studies that tell people to follow every urge, in a culture that mocks chastity and lifts up selfishness as a virtue. The greatest victory of evil, he said, is not in leading people to hate God, but in convincing them that what they are doing is not wrong at all. He called this the age of spiritual numbness, a world where people can destroy themselves with a smile, never realizing what is at stake. But he also said that God's grace is always stronger, always near, always ready to pull anyone back, no matter how far they have fallen. In his letters and speeches, the Pope offered a roadmap for freedom and healing. First, he urged immediate, honest confession, not after weeks of delay, but today, as soon as the heart recognizes the need. Not just confessing the action, but confessing the excuses, the pride, the ways a person has tried to handle things alone. Confession is about mercy, not just forgiveness. It is about receiving new power to fight, to stand, to hope. Second, he spoke about environmental warfare, removing temptations, changing routines, building a life that supports virtue, not vice. If a phone, a computer, a habit leads to sin, he said, cut it out, not as a punishment, but as a strategy for freedom. Third, he reminded people that prayer is not a magic spell, but a relationship, a conversation that changes